As promised, we have with us Professor Atia Waris, Professor of Fiscal Law and UN independent expert on foreign debt. Thank you for joining us this morning. A lot of pronouncements have been made by President William Ruto. We saw Eric Oduor make reference to the first 50 days. That's the top story on the Daily Nation this morning. First 50 days of the Ruto regime. And I can see here on the ticker, do you have your paper there? Yes, at the bottom there, more taxes, more new levies for NHIF and NSSF, supported by Kotu's Tuoli, meaning workers will take home less pay, hence more tightening of belts. We saw Raila Odinga say that, what did he say? No taxes without representation. We'll hear that. We'll hear directly from him on that before we get into this conversation. But the KRA, which William Ruto has proposed change to Kenya Revenue Service to be more accommodating or be friendlier to the taxpayer, has given KRA a target of 3 trillion by the next financial year. And then he talked about doubling their collections over the course of the next 5 years. So we get into all those details. We also have Alex Kanyi with us. He's joining us virtually from Mombasa. There he is. Good morning, Alex. Good to see you. He's a partner, Cliff Decker and Hoffmeyer. All right, before we get into that conversation, I did reference statements made by President William Ruto, statements made by opposition leader Raila Odinga. Let's begin with what William Ruto had to say at the Kenya Taxpayers Day at the Kenyatta International Convention Center about 4 days ago. And our own Brian George covered that event for us.
Excess duty is one of Kenya's fastest growing sources of tax revenue, mopping up an average of 105 billion Kenya shillings annually.
Safaricom.
President William Ruto states that despite recent efforts to widen the reach of excess tax in the country, a lot more is still being lost in leakage and there is need to bring it back to the net.
We are selling 2.9 billion stamps for our sizable products, while our neighbor, Tanzania, is selling 7.2 billion stamps. Uganda is selling 9 billion stamps. Those two economies are smaller than ours. It means we should be selling between 10 billion and 12 billion stamps. But the trouble is, the government is selling 2.9 billion stamps. There are people who are selling the balance, which is approximately 7 billion stamps. And I have told the Commissioner General he must tell these people to stop. And we have no choice. Because I do not want to fight with people, but I must stop. I want to tell the good people in KRA, good people, you must stop.
The president has reiterated his quest to have the introduction of wealth tax as a key plank in his tax revenue mobilization agenda. Kenya has in the past toyed with the idea of taxing idle land as part of wealth tax, as well as introducing tax on inheritance.
We shall tax wealth, consumption, income, and trade in that order. As if, and by the way, I will lead from the front by paying my taxes. And every company associated with me will lead from the front in paying taxes.
Currently, Nairobi City County is concluding the process of being autonomous from KRA and will soon launch Nairobi Pay revenue collection system as it launches the single business permit.
Safaricom PLC, Kenya Breweries Limited and Twiga Foods came first runners-up and first runners-up, respectively, in the Taxpayers Awards this year by KRA. Brian George Otieno, NTV from KICC, Nairobi.
All right, let's take a look at what Raila Odinga, the opposition leader, Azimio la Umoja One Kenya party leader, had to say on the subject of increased deductions by way of NSSF and NHIF.
The funeral service of the mother to Kakamega Governor Fernandes Barasa was turned into a podium for political attacks aimed at the Kenya Kwanza leadership. Raila launched an offensive against the DPP over what he termed as selective treatment of cases. In a span of 2 months, several cases that were in court against top Kenya Kwanza leaders, including Deputy President Rigathi Gachagua, have all been dropped. And now, Raila is calling for the release of Sirisia MP John Waluke, whose appeal against his 67-year sentence was quashed by the High Court.
Unawacha Lenturi, unawacha Gaza, unawacha yule mama mwingine huko, alafu Waluke wanachukua wanaweka ndani miaka 67. Hiyo ni haki kweli? Hiyo ni haki kweli? Tunataka Waluke apewe bond, alafu hiyo kesi baadaye itupuliwe mbali.
On Sunday, Raila threatened to lead his perceived strongholds to boycott paying taxes should there be an inequitable distribution of resources to all regions in the country. It appears his thoughts on tax boycotting haven't changed.
Jukumu serikali ya juu ni ya kitaifa. Hawezi kusema atabagua Kakamega kwa sababu nyinyi mlipiga kura kwa Azimio, apeleke huko pande ya bonde la Ufa, azii huko pale mbana walipata kura. Hapana. Maana yako ushuru wanarogota kila mahali.
The leaders castigated DP Rigathi, who had on Sunday rained barbs at Odinga.
Wewe mzee sikia, we have no business within our government. Hatuna haja na hatugojei wewe, we are not looking for you and we have no time.
Ndugu Gachagua, whom I don't understand, huyo simuelewi. Rigathi,
nasikia yule mwingine asina nilo nani? Atikacheta. Anaweka. Lakini mimi siwezi kujivana na hao watu.
From their pronouncements, Azimio allied leaders appear to be spoiling for a political battle that will take their oversight of the government to another level.
We cannot look back. Sisi tuko na chuma ile ya zamani na moto bado itakuwepo hapa Kenya, mukifanya nyokonyoko mfanye kazi vile muli ahidi watu wa Kenya.
Tumeonea hao jamaa kwa 18. Na kama kuna watu wataregarega, I will be the last person to fall. We are going to fight tooth and nail to defend the democracy you fought for, to defend devolution.
The Azimio leadership had promised to name a shadow cabinet upon Raila's return from India. This, in turn, puts the spotlight on their next course of action, even as they seek to re-energize their supporters to rally behind them as they spot-check the government. Sydney Chazima, NTV.
All right, there you have it. The pronouncements to do with tax. I'll start with you, Professor. What did you make of the statements made by William Ruto at the Taxpayers' Day?
So, I mean, he's maintaining a standard and he's maintaining a consistency, which I think for a new president is very important. His messaging is clear and it's all going towards widening the tax base. But what I think is very interesting, if I contrast with what the opposition are talking about, is the moment, so tax is always a political tool. It's a compromise, it's a suboptimal compromise, I say this a lot. But the biggest challenge you will face as a country is when you take the tax as a political tool only and don't look at the reality on the ground on what you have to roll out. Now, we're in a global financial crisis. Next year is going to be worse than this year. I'll say this again. Next year is going to be worse than this year. We already heard that some journalists are not being paid salaries. There are delays in payments of salaries, even in other parts of the industry, both private and public sector. There is a tension in accessing finance. If you take taxes in a point in a country's history where there is an economic crisis and then you put pressure on the stability of that finance, then you can cause chaos. And I think it's very important that we take a step back, because calls like this to not pay taxes will lead to a very dangerous slope. So for example, if we use the statistics which the president has been using, only 7 million people with approximately 6 to 7 million and about 1 million companies on the database, but 18 million human beings saying, widen the tax base. But if you now draw the parallel to the boycott conversation, then who boycotts? Is it the 7 million who are going to boycott paying income tax? Or is it 18 million plus who are going to boycott paying VAT? And frankly, VAT is already embedded into goods and services, so you can't exactly boycott that. Now, if you weaken the income tax collection process, which is those 7 million basically, then you will have a serious problem, because the solution of the government will be to increase indirect taxes. And you can't really boycott those. So this conversation has to be really nuanced, and people really need to think about what they're doing. But and what messaging they're passing on to the populations across the country. But I also think it's very interesting. He says prioritize wealth tax. That's a breath of fresh air. What if we can get the wealthier to pay higher taxes, then we move towards a more equal society, which is very important. My concern is his choice between consumption and trade taxes. Mm-hmm. So you're looking at the indirect taxes before you're going to look at corporations and trade and business. Now, it's an interesting balance, because we are in debt and our foreign exchange is very much linked to getting money to pay off our interest every year and to pay off the debt gradually. And so destabilizing our currency is something we have to be very careful about, which makes sense as to why he puts trade at the third level. But then if you come back and say, but if we're going to widen the tax base, then I would have hoped he would have said he's going to focus on income, not consumption. So those would be the nuances I see coming from what he's saying.
All right. Alex, what did you make of those statements made by President William Ruto at the Taxpayers' Day? Did you see it coming? Did they come as a surprise? Which of the two? Or was it somewhere in between?
No, I don't think anything has come by surprise. So I think the story has been consistent, starting from Kenya Kwanza's manifesto. So when I took a deep dive into the manifesto, I realized that at some point they wanted to focus on the informal sector to increase or expand the tax base. Then at some point they also dropped it, I think, just to be popular. So that story of being friendly in terms of how we collect taxes is what then has informed, I think, this discussion from the time the government took over. So you started with a little bit of a shock in terms of removing the fuel subsidy. But then you heard about fertilizers, making sure that we ensure that the cost of input is lowered. Then you've moved on to ensure that KRA is friendly. Start with the, with wealth as you move to trade, to make sure that you collect your taxes. And basically, when you even look at that criteria, you're saying, let us look at the people who already have the money, target them to raise the taxes, and perhaps get to the hustlers last. But with consumption, anyone, doesn't matter what class you belong to. If you consume, it means you have money, and therefore it's easy actually to collect that.
All right. So when you, both yourself and Professor have talked about this, because he ranked wealth first, so he said we'll go after the wealthy the most, and then he went to income, consumption, then trade. How do we get these wealthy to pay more tax? Alex?
Well, what I hear KRA saying, and especially from this particular tax conference, is that they already know the people who are perhaps wealthy, and the question is then the how to ask them to actually pay more. So there are discussions around, should we, for example, for pay as you earn, increase the rates to target the people who are earning more? So that is one of the discussions that is going around. Should we also tax land? Because if you hold masses of land, we are assuming that you're also wealthy. And should we start with even taxing that so that we target the wealthy? Or because I don't see, you know, with tax, it's not like a harambe where you ask someone to contribute whatever they want. It's you know, you're more targeted towards this is how much they have, and this is what you expect them to contribute in terms of taxes.
Okay. Professor Waris, how do you go about getting the wealthy? Like he said, Alex has said, it's not like it's a harambe.
Yeah, I think for me maybe the million-shilling question is, who is the wealthy? And I think if we say increase the tax brackets, which is a fair, you know, which is a fair suggestion, then the problem with that is you're looking at the 7 million, and there are wealthy within that 11 million bundle that are not even on the tax base. So I think even as they structure how they're going to target who the wealthy is, also look and see who's not been paying taxes. And don't necessarily now go for the wealthy who have been paying taxes, because here's the balance we're going to have to find over the next 5 years while he's in leadership, is how do you keep the 7 million stable and paying taxes and not get them angry? Because when you start to discover the data and the information on the 11 million who've not been paying taxes, there is going to be a lot of tension in the society because of that. So if we now look at that, that's one layer of, for me, where to tease out the wealthy. And when we talk about informal sector, which is those 11 million, again, there are big businesses in those 11 million that have survived through informality and have thrived in informality. And we have that additional space. When there was mention about looking into businesses on Facebook, on social, in different social platforms, and digitization has enhanced the ability to be informal. So you can see there are things being rolled out that are looking towards how to formalize the informal, but in very gentle ways, which I think is good. Don't shock your population, don't scare them, but bring them in gently, I think is something I can hear. And this is why I was laughing earlier, because in 50 days to do all of this from a tax perspective, this is very strong. Like he's moving at a very stable, calm place, and you can see what he's doing. He's telling you what he's doing. He's being very transparent about it, which I think is something very important for Kenyans to internalize. So that would be for me the informal. Now there is the conversation about land, but the problem is not all of our land is producing. So if we look at the agricultural sector, we have a global food crisis. Is now the time to target farmers? Becomes now the question. You break down the industries, you see who has been joining on board, who has been paying taxes, who hasn't. Now we split that apart. Now we look at the industries. And we say, if you have been overall compliant, we also need to let you go a little bit. If you look at the aviation industry and COVID globally, very big struggle. Maybe leave them alone a little bit. The fuel crisis made it even worse for the aviation industry. So these are now the nuances which he has to sort of tease out. But I find it very interesting when he talked about Kenya Revenue Services.
Yes.
And I don't know yet what that's going to look like. But I think a rebranding of them may be very interesting, because I remember having a hectic debate with people at KRA saying, why is your handle KRA Cares? Because Kenyans don't think KRA cares. And it's very like, oh my God, why would you use that word? You're misusing the word in the English language. But I think rebranding them might be an interesting way of softening that space and bringing them on board, but also opening up for the country to say, look, we all benefited from COVID in some way or another. We also realized that if we don't strengthen our domestic services, we will have a problem. There are conversations about an Ebola crisis. So we need to strengthen our healthcare systems without a doubt. And then I look at our neighbors where the drought is so bad, and you know, here it is also pretty bad, where the next generation are dying because of lack of food and water. So we have to look after our next generation, because even if that generation survives this drought, lack of food means they will be seriously disadvantaged. It affects your mind, it affects your ability to work and operate, and we are an economy that needs those people there.
Okay. Alex, I'm curious, as Professor here has posed, who are the wealthy? Have they given you any indication of who falls in this bracket? And, or is there a globally accepted definition of wealthy?
We're actually waiting for KRA to define that, so that we are clear as to who is wealthy and then what measures we adopt to target the wealthy. So that hasn't been defined yet. So it's something that we are looking forward to seeing how you know, KRA will define it. But you know, from perhaps what I see other economies do, then it's not just about you know, with disclosure and you know, sharing of information and technology, so that even systems within government are speaking to each other. I tend to think that there's information that the government already has. Okay, so if they want to target the people who they believe are wealthy, then it's quite possible for them to get this. For example, you have guys with foreign bank accounts. You recently had people declaring their worth. You know, particular class of people perhaps would have money. So we'll wait to see how KRA defines it.
All right, and he talked about this register of taxpayers, and he talked about KRA having a register of about 7 million tax-paying Kenyans, and then he compared that with Safaricom, which he said has 30 million, if I recall correctly, yes, registered users, which means they're over the age of 18 and therefore eligible to pay tax. Alex, he talked about the KRA employing alternative means and ways of now roping in these taxpayers. What did you make of that statement?
I think we shouldn't say that we have equivalent of 30 million taxpayers out there. First, you have perhaps people with multiple lines. Then second, you shouldn't confuse having an ID to actually earning income. So you become 18 because of just natural causes, age, you know, but going to get actually that income and earning something that is worth taxing, that's a different question. While we have the youth who are now coming onto TikTok and doing things on the digital platforms, you also have a very high rate of unemployment. Look at the guys who are transitioning from university to jobs. That's a problem that the government already knows it's there. So you may have someone who is 18, but they don't have a job, they don't have income. Personally, I don't think I was making money at the age of 18.
All right. Professor, explain to us these stamps that were talked about. What are they about? I saw Brian George, to the layman such as myself, talk about excise. Explain to us, like, you know, in plain English, what is this all about?
But can I respectfully disagree first? Well, one thing I think we'll agree on is how to define who is wealthy is not clear. But I also think the other important thing to do is how to define who is not wealthy. So if people earning 10,000 shillings or 15,000 shillings a month right now are paying taxes, which is the 10% bracket, then that's like $3 a day. $3 a day should not be taxed. So I think we need to sieve out who should get a tax exemption. The student who has just graduated, the 18-year-old, should register and file returns, but file nil returns. So get our population into the rhythm of knowing that they're supposed to pay taxes, I think is something very important. But I also think the idea of a single ID number, it's not revolutionary. It is what most countries in the global north do. It's most countries in Latin America are doing it now. You have what they call a social security number or an identification number. You get it when you're born. So you don't get another number when you turn 18. But that same number clicks into action at different points in time based on the age of the person. So at 18, it opens up and you now start filling in returns. At 60 or 70, you now retire. It clicks into the pension system. And I think that is what we need to put in place. We have a digital savannah. Why are we not digitizing our systems if we're so brilliant at digital systems? I think we're not using our own skill sets for that.
And it's something he did raise with the carrier, because he said, and we need to make this processes easier and simpler.
Yes, and you can actually have a system where the tax return is pre-filled. So it just collects the data as you're paying your PAYE, and you don't now have to struggle with an accountant or an agent somewhere. You actually receive a form, you open it up, and it tells you exactly what your taxes were that year, and then you fill in anything that's missing, right? And since we're a hustler nation, you fill in your side hustle, right?
Yeah.
So that's what we can do, and I think it is possible, and I think we have the capacity for it. But I also think that there seems to be some confusion between what are existing laws and what are new laws that he may be suggesting. It is an existing law that when you turn 18, you're supposed to file your returns, even if they're nil returns, and that you're supposed to be registered for tax. And I think that's a really important conversation, because those 7 million means that there are 11 that aren't even registered. So why aren't they? I mean, that's a whole conversation by itself about the widening of the tax bases.
Although to be fair to Carrie, the last time I filed my returns, I did find the form was pre-filled, much to my
surprise.
Yes.
Yes, they're getting better. They're getting better.
Yeah.
But that's the fear, that's the passing on that information, building the capacity of the population, making sure they understand the form. Because one part of it is, will it be pre-filled or not? Then when they get to it, they'll only be pre-filled if you've been doing it before. But if you're new, then what do? Do you understand what the things mean on the form? Is there capacity building around it? And I always tell people, I've never been to an area of like the Juakali sector where I find the company's registry. They're saying, hi, please come register your company with us because we're trying to formalize the informal sector. I've never seen that. There's one company registry. Are there offices around the country? So then is company registry only for Nairobians or city people, right? These are now things that we have to put in place to unpack what he's saying. But the stamp duty.
Okay.
Yeah, a little bit more boring, but important revenue source for government. So every time you pay the excise duty, or they actually put a stamp, like it's an actual stamp, like you can lick and stick it. And
so excise duty is paid on what?
Oh, excise duty can be paid on alcohol. Help me out on the more recent additions to it. A lot of imports have excise duty. We often call it a sin tax. Okay, so definition. So excise duty, or the excise, is not a tax, right? It's not seen to be a tax per se. It's a payment usually on imports. If it's not the import of the final product, it's also importation on the chemicals or the components of what makes that final product. It can have multiple payments, which is why he talks about the figures. But the most important one usually is it's on imports and on luxury goods very often.
So this is the importer who's footing the bill?
The person, no. So this is very important to know. even when we celebrate the highest taxpayers, I always laugh because, with great respect to Safaricom, you're not the highest taxpayer. It's the person who talked on the phone the most who's the highest taxpayer, right? Because they paid the highest amount of tax. They always pass down the payment to the final consumer.
Okay.
The person that pays it, who is the company, pays it more like an agent. The person that shoulders the burden of it, the person whose actual money goes from their pocket, is the person that's using the item.
Okay.
It's like with the telephone, right? Safaricom collects the money and hands it over to the Revenue Authority or Revenue Service, right? But the person who actually gave the money, you know, was the person that used it. The same thing with the electricity bill. You see it embedded in the bill, right? The person who submitted it was Kenya Power, but the person whose money goes out is the user of the electricity. So, and this is where, when I talked about this issue of a boycott, becomes so problematic, because how do you boycott that? Like, you're going to pay your electricity bill if you want electricity, so you can't really boycott, right? So these are now the nuances that people start to look at. But he's right about one thing. The figures don't make sense. And I think there's a reason to actually go and inquire into that. Because you hear, unfortunately, and it's a lot to do with we call them non-tariff barriers, but in common language we say corruption. And it's a problem because we have a lot of stories in Kenya, anecdotal stories, about ladies with beautiful hair extensions, but how can they afford it, right? And we hear this about Revenue Authority officials who sit at certain border posts, for example. And these are conversations that have to be had.